The boardroom, the field, the leadership table. To most, it's just the office. To me, it's the arena. Welcome to In the Arena with Stephanie, the briefing room for high-achieving Christian women navigating the complexities of male-dominated industries. I'm your host, Stephanie Brown, CEO of Her Authenticity, leadership coach, and master Christian life coach. You aren't in these spaces by accident. You are there on assignment. I believe that when you lead with biblical excellence, success is the inevitable overflow. Through this podcast, we're reclaiming your kingdom authority and expanding your corporate influence, equipping you to lead as the authentic ambassador you were created to be. Let's step into the arena. Welcome back to In the Arena with Stephanie. I'm glad that you joined us today. Well, we're going to continue our series on identity. And today we are talking about something that you probably think of as a weakness. Maybe even you've tried to overcome this or suppress this or even hide it. Today, we are talking about imposter syndrome. But what if I told you that it's not a weakness? What if the very thing that you've been trying to get rid of is actually one of your greatest leadership strengths? Are you ready to hear more? Let's dive in. Let me tell you about a moment when I kind of dealt with imposter syndrome and I shifted the way that I thought about it. It's a moment that I don't think I'll ever forget. I had just been assigned a new role. It was a role that I wasn't very familiar with, but I took it because I wanted to stretch myself. And I can remember shortly after being in the role, my manager asking me to go on a trip so that we could observe the team and that I could get up to speed. As I walked in that room, to be 100% honest and transparent, I wasn't very comfortable. I was completely out of my lane. And as I looked around the room, everyone else had been working in this area for many, many years. They knew the systems, they knew the terminology, they knew the history, and here I was, brand new, still learning, still growing in this particular space. But I decided to show up with confidence and as the authentic self that I know to be. As I sat in the room, I listened as the meeting progressed, and I found myself asking questions. I asked a lot of clarifying questions to get a broader understanding of what they were sharing with me. So questions like, why are we doing it this way? What happens if we approach it from this angle? I even offered a few insights that were based on things that I was hearing within the meeting. And then I can remember that one day, my leader pulling me aside, and she said something I totally was not expecting. We started talking about the meetings, and she started asking me, was I learning and how did I feel about the information and those type of things. And then she said to me, she said, you're the smartest one in the room. Now, I can remember thinking, there is no way that can be right. I hadn't really said much in the meetings. I didn't have the most experience. I definitely didn't have all the answers. In fact, I felt like I was barely keeping up. But here's what the leader saw that I didn't. The questions I was asking, the ones that were born out of my uncertainty and my uncomfortableness, those were the questions that the team had stopped asking years ago. My self awareness or my imposter syndrome, the part of me that knew I didn't have all the answers, it wasn't a liability. It was an asset because I wasn't performing confidence that I didn't have. I wasn't pretending to know more than I did. I was just asking, I was listening, and I was learning. And that's what the room needed. As I reflect on this years later, that moment, those meetings, that experience, it taught me something that I want to share with you today. What you've been calling imposter syndrome, when it's rooted in truth, it's actually self awareness and it's an opportunity for your personal growth. It's not disqualification. And when you look at it, personal growth, self awareness, and discernment is a leadership strength, not a weakness. I remember our CEO, Jenny Rametti, who was the former CEO of IBM and the only woman CEO. She once said that growth and comfort do not coexist. So you may not feel comfortable when you experience the proverbial imposter syndrome because you are growing. And so your comfort and your growth are not going to coexist. So could it be that when you are experiencing imposter syndrome, you are experiencing growth pains? So let's look at it a little closer. What is imposter syndrome actually telling us? At some point, someone was experiencing these feelings and they gave it a name and they named it imposter syndrome. And high achieving women like yourself have been carrying this into the room for years. What is it? What are you feeling when we say imposter syndrome? It's that persistent, nagging sense that you don't fully belong here. It's that feeling that you somehow have slipped in past the gatekeepers, that it's only a matter of time before someone figures out that you're not as qualified as they think you are. And for years, you've been told that when you are feeling this way, that it is something that you need to overcome. It's something that you need to get over. It's something that you need to fix. It's a weakness that you need to eliminate. But I want to offer you a different way of seeing it. So, imposter syndrome says you're a fraud. You're a fraud who snuck into a room where you don't belong. But your divine identity as an ambassador of Christ, it says that you were strategically placed in that room by God who built you for it. You see, the self awareness inside imposter syndrome, the part that says, I know I don't have all the answers. I know I'm not the loudest one. I know I'm still learning. That's not evidence of fraud, but instead, though, that is evidence of growth. And that's the humility that keeps leaders from becoming the worst version of the people who may have come before them. That self awareness that keeps you asking the right questions instead of assuming you already know everything. It's that self awareness that God can use. In fact, I believe He prefers it. Throughout Scripture, we see a consistent pattern. It's a pattern where God chooses people who are not confident in their own abilities and their own strengths. It's people who have self awareness. Think about it. When God calls leaders, many of them didn't respond with confidence. Instead, they responded with self awareness. They told God about their weaknesses. Think about Mary, the mother of Jesus. She asked the question, how will this be? After the angel told her that she would conceive a child, she asked the question, how would this be? Because she knew her current reality, she knew her limitations, and she knew the gap between the two. She didn't even pretend that she understood. But notice what the angel said to her. He called her the highly favored one, and he told her that the Lord is with you, and blessed are you among women. What about Esther? Esther recognized the risk and initially she hesitated. She understood the systems of how you would approach the king. But Esther became courageous. She became courageous after she counted the cost. Esther 4 and 14 says, for if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther's quote unquote imposter syndrome didn't stop her from doing her assignment. Do you see the pattern? The people God used most powerfully were the ones who knew they didn't have it all figured out. You see, imposter syndrome often paralyzes us. But here's the key. Self awareness didn't stop the women that I just talked about and other people in the Bible. Instead, it positioned them to depend on God. And that is what God wants from his ambassadors. The self awareness that you've been calling a weakness is the very thing that keeps you asking the right questions instead of assuming you already have all the answers. Here's what I need you to hear today. Your self awareness is not a bug in your leadership, it's a feature. The fact that you walk into rooms aware that you don't know everything, I wouldn't call that fraud. I would call that wisdom. The fact that you ask questions instead of pretending that you have all the answer, I wouldn't call that weakness. I would call it humility. And the fact that you're still learning and you're still growing and you're still refining your expertise, I wouldn't call that inadequacy. I would call that maturity. So stop treating your self awareness as a liability. It's the first sign of a leader that God can trust. Because here's the truth, the most dangerous leaders are the ones who think they've arrived. It's the ones who stop asking questions. It's the ones who assume that they know everything. Those are the leaders who make catastrophic decisions because they're not humble enough to seek counsel. They don't have the self awareness to recognize their own blind spots. They're not wise enough to know what they don't know. But you, my sister, you are not that leader. You're an ambassador of Christ who knows that you're still learning, who knows that you're still growing. You're the type of ambassador that God can use to do extraordinary things. All right, so what do you actually do with this new framework? How do you turn imposter syndrome from something that silences you into something that strengthens you. Let me give you 3 steps. Step number 1, identify where imposter syndrome has silenced you. Think about last week or the last few weeks. Where did you feel imposter syndrome? And where did you let it keep you silent? Think back. Was it in a meeting where you had a question, but you didn't ask it because you didn't want to seem uninformed? Was it a conversation where you had insight, but you didn't dare share it because you felt like you weren't senior enough to contribute? Or maybe it was an opportunity that you didn't pursue because you convinced yourself that you weren't qualified. So take a moment, write it down, write down what you were feeling. Step number 2, I want you to reframe the feeling as growth and not fraud, not imposter. Now, here's the shift that you need to make. Instead of saying, I feel like an imposter because I didn't know everything, I want you to say this instead. I feel uncertain because I'm still learning, and learning is part of my growth process. That's it. That's the reframe. You're not an imposter, you're a learner. You're not an imposter, you're growing. And every great leader is always learning and they're always growing. Think about Solomon. He was one of the wisest men in history. And it started by him admitting that he was just a little child who did not know how to carry out his duties. Your self-awareness isn't evidence you don't belong. It's evidence you're growing. Step number 3, speak up anyway. So here's what you need to do this week. Here's your step for this week. This is your number 3 is what you need to implement this week. The next time you feel imposter syndrome creeping in, the next time you have a question or an insight, but you're tempted to stay silent, speak up anyway. Not because you have the answers, but because your questions or your insights may be exactly what the room needs. Remember my story? I asked questions because I didn't know the answers. And those questions were exactly what the team needed to hear. Remember, your self-awareness is not weakness. It's a strength. I want you to remember that. You're not an imposter. You're growing. So this week, identify one place where imposter syndrome has kept you silent and speak up. Go ahead, ask that question. Share that insight, offer your perspective, and then trust that God placed you in that room for a reason. And that reason includes your self-awareness, not in spite of it. So the 3 steps. Step number 1, identify where imposter syndrome has silenced you. Step number 2, reframe the feeling as growth and not fraud and not imposter. And then number 3, speak up anyway. All right, that's this week's episode. Your self-awareness is not your weakness. It's the first sign of a leader that God can trust. So remember, here's what I need you to do. First, take those 3 steps that I mentioned a few moments ago. Identify the imposter syndrome, reframe it as growth, and then speak up anyway. Second, if you haven't already, subscribe so that you don't miss next Thursday's episode. Third, if you're getting value from this podcast, go ahead and grab my playbook, The Balance Myth, God's Woman in a Male-Dominated Arena. The link is in the show notes. And fourth, Share this episode with one woman who's been letting imposter syndrome keep her silent. Tell her your self-awareness is a strength. And remember, you don't have to have all the answers. You just have to show up, ask the right questions, and trust that God will use your humility to lead well. So stop calling it a weakness. It's the imposter advantage. And remember, kingdom authority and corporate influence, it's yours. So go be the ambassador that God created. I'm Stephanie, and I'll see you in the arena.